Hi, I'm Gareth, and we're going to have a little think about something that people keep asking about for understandable reasons. Why on earth do we end up with these funny notes called B sharp and E sharp and C flat and F flat? And we've got some people posting comments saying these notes don't exist. Well, they do exist, and I just want to try and explain why that is the case. So first of all, let's just look at the keyboard and just take a simple scale of C major. So C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, which works entirely on the white notes. And in a major scale, we always have a pattern that goes tone, tone, semitone, tone, 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 semitone. A semitone being the shortest distance you can find between two notes. So you notice there's just a semitone between E and F because there's no black note in between E and F. There's just a semitone between B and C because there's no black note between B and C either. But when I go C to D, well, there is a black note in between, isn't there? So C to this black note is a semitone. This black note to the next note D is another semitone. So C to D is two semitones or one tone. So any major scale goes tone, tone, semitone, tone, 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 semitone. And when we write a scale, we have one of each letter. So I'm starting on C and I'm going up each successive letter. C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. Okay, so when I go to another scale and I replicate that pattern, I'm going to need to use some sharps or flats. So if I take G major, it goes tone, tone, semitone, tone, 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 semitone, just as C major did. But you notice this time I have to use F sharp. So I'm going G, A, B, C, D, E, F sharp, G. And again, I've got one of each letter. Now, you could say to me, well, this note could be F sharp, but why do you have to call it F sharp? You could call it G flat. Well, it's perfectly true, because if I sharpen something, I raise it a semitone. So if this is F and I raise it a semitone, I get F sharp. But if this is G and I lower it a semitone, I get G flat. So a sharp raises a note by a semitone, a flat lowers a note by a semitone. So that's why in G major we would call this F sharp and not G flat. If I called it G flat, I'd end up with two kinds of G. I'd get G ordinary G, G natural, and G flat, and I'd have no kind of F because it would go G, A, B, C, D, E, G flat, G natural. So I've got two kinds of G and no kind of F. That makes it a bit difficult when you write music, because how do you know which G is G and which G is G flat? Much easier to call this note F sharp. However, if I'm in the key of G flat major, well, I'm not going to call the first note F sharp, I'm going to call it G flat. And if I go tone, tone, semitone, tone, 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 semitone, and I want one of each letter, I end up with this scale that goes G flat, A flat, B flat, C flat, D flat, E flat, F, G flat. So do you see I've got one of each letter, G, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. But because I'm starting on G flat, I've got to go tone, tone, semitone, and then I'm moving on from there, tone, 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 semitone. So all these major scales do this tone, tone, semitone, tone, 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 semitone pattern, and we have to have one of each letter. So hopefully you can see from that explanation that if I'm in the key of G major, going tone, tone, semitone, tone, 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 semitone, I'm going to use F sharp, G, A, B, C, D, E, F sharp, G. But if I'm in G flat major, I'm not going to call that F sharp, I'm going to call it G flat. So G flat, A flat, B flat, C flat, D flat, E flat, F, G flat. So hopefully that explains a word that we call enharmonic. enharmonic. Enharmonic means it sounds the same as something else, but it looks different. So F sharp is an enharmonic equivalent of G flat, or G flat is an enharmonic equivalent of F sharp. So you see how that works. Now you also probably notice in this scale, the fourth note of the scale of G flat major is C flat. Well, have a look at this note, because mostly we're going to call this note B. When we were in G major, we went G, A, B. But because of everything I've now explained, can you see why this has to go G flat, A flat, B flat, C flat? So now we're beginning to answer this question. So this note is usually called E, but it could be called F flat because it's one semitone below F. This note's normally called F, but it could be called E sharp because it's a semitone above E. This note's normally called B, but it could be called C flat because it's one semitone below C. This note's normally called C, but it could be called B sharp because it's one semitone above B. So get hold of this idea of enharmonics, that every note actually has more than one letter name. And even though we're normally going to call this note C, it might be called B sharp. Now, just to kind of thicken the plot a little bit, we also have these things called double sharps and double flats. Oh my goodness, what does that mean? Well, if a sharp raises a note a semitone, then a double sharp is going to raise a note two semitones or one tone. If a flat lowers a note by a semitone, a double flat is going to lower it by two semitones or one tone. And just to add to the fun, the sign for a double flat is this, two flats, so that seems kind of logical, doesn't it? So you would imagine that the sign for a double sharp would be two sharps. Sadly, it isn't. The double sharp sign is an X, or it might be written as X that way. So double flat sign and double sharp sign. Now, why would we need a double sharp? Well, for the same reasons that I've just explained. But when we go into minor keys, life gets even more interesting. The minor keys don't follow the same pattern of tone, tone, semitone and tone, 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 semitone that the majors do, but they have a different pattern. But when we're in a minor scale, we sometimes have to raise the seventh note of the scale. Okay, now in G sharp minor, if you know about keys, don't worry if you don't, but if you know about keys and the circle of fifths, if you're not sure about keys, have a look at our video on the circle of fifths that explains all of this completely. But G sharp minor on the circle of fifths, in the kind of order of keys, has 5 sharps. Now it has F sharp, C sharp, G sharp, D sharp, and A sharp. That's the order of 5 sharps that take you to G sharp minor. But because it's G sharp minor, we have to raise the 7th note. Well, the 7th note is supposed to be F sharp, but because it's already, that's F, it's already F sharp, if I raise it another semitone, it goes up to G. But as I said earlier, you can't have a scale with no Fs and 2 Gs. So how can I call this G something else that actually looks like F? The only thing I can do is call it F double sharp. So here's F sharp, that's where it started in this key signature. If I raise it a semitone, it becomes F double sharp. So I can have double sharps and I can have double flats, as well as having sharps and flats that you think, well, surely that note should be called something else. So I hope that brief explanation makes some sense, but I want to show you this in a real piece of music. So we're going to have a quick look at a fugue by Bach. It's the fugue in G sharp minor from the Well-Tempered Clavier Book 1, and it's BWV 863 if you're wanting the reference to the piece. That's the kind of code of which piece it is in Bach's repertoire. So if we have a look at this for a moment, it starts off with this single melody. It's called a fugue subject, and it goes like this. Now this is in the key of G sharp minor, as I said, and a moment ago I was explaining about this scale of G sharp minor, and I was saying it had 5 sharps. Now here are the 5 sharps in the key symmetry. You see I went through them: F sharp, C sharp, G sharp, D sharp and A sharp. But when we write out the scale of G sharp minor, remember we have to raise the 7th note some of the time. Now you can see right at the beginning of this, in the very first bar, the 2nd note has got one of these double sharp signs. So we start with G sharp. The 2nd note looks like it's a G when you see it on the keyboard, but because we've had G sharp, we've got to call this F double sharp. You'll notice in the 2nd bar, on the 2nd note of the 2nd bar, we've got C double sharp there, because that started life as a C sharp and is being raised a semitone to C double sharp. So in the 2nd bar, we start with G sharp, we go to C double sharp, which is the same as D, and the next note is D sharp. Okay, now could Bach have gone D natural, D sharp? He could have done, but it wouldn't have sat quite comfortably with the key when we organise things in scales like that. Okay, and just to be sure about these other things we've talked about, when we look at bar 3, you can see in this bar, the 2nd note of the left hand is an E sharp, so the left hand starts D sharp and then it goes E sharp. And again, you might think, well, why is it not called F? Because F doesn't belong to this key, to this scale. So this one is an E sharp in this case. We've slightly moved to a different scale for a moment there, but that's E sharp rather than F. And then in the right hand, the first note of the right hand is D sharp. The 2nd note is a B sharp. Now again, you'd look at that and you think, surely that should be C, but no, for the reasons that we've just talked about, we're going D sharp and then we're going B sharp and then the next note is C sharp. So hopefully that's helping to understand why sometimes B might be called B sharp or E might be called E sharp, or why sometimes we might actually need to use even these double sharps and double flats. And there's one other example we're just going to have a quick look at. And this one is by Chopin, and it's his Polonaise in G flat major, and it goes something like this. That's how it starts. Okay, now this is in the key of G flat major, which is why I've got this scale here. So there's the scale of G flat major. And you can see at the beginning, we've got a key signature, haven't we, with 6 flats: B flat, E flat, A flat, D flat, G flat, C flat. So I've got these here, you see, B flat, E flat, A flat, D flat, G flat, top and bottom, and C flat. And if it's in a major key, then we just use the flats or the sharps from the key signature. When we have minor keys, then we do this thing about raising the 7th note a semitone. And sometimes we do something more complicated if we're using a melodic minor, where we raise the 6th and the 7th notes by a semitone when we're going up the scale, but not when we're coming down the scale. Okay, we've got other videos on that if that's a topic you're interested in looking at. Now, as we look through this piece, we also see the same principle at work. So, I mean, you notice, for example, even in the first bar, he's put a D natural in here because he doesn't want the D flat from the key signature. He's on the move already. We've got A natural and C natural in the next bar. But have a look in this next bar. We've got an F flat, 2nd chord, bottom of the right hand, which is in the bass clef. So F flat looks as if it should be E, but it's F flat because of where we're going with the key. It's starting to move. You see, we're in G flat major at the beginning, but then it's starting to move to C flat major. So by the time we get to the end of the first line, we've ended up in C flat major, and C flat major is going to end up with an F flat because it's going to go C flat, D flat, E flat, F flat, G flat, A flat, B flat, C flat. So you see why we've got F there and not E. We've already had E flat, we need some kind of F, so it has to be F flat. So that explains a little bit of why we've got an F flat in there. And we've also got things like C flat around. So for example, if we have a look at this bar, you can see on the second chord of the right hand, there is a C flat. It's the third note down from the top. So again, there's C flat. Often we'd call that B, but here it's going to be a C flat because it's being used in the context of G flat major, and there's C flat. And you can see why you can't call it B. We've already had a B, it's a B flat. Now we need a C, so it's going to have to be C flat. So you see how that works. And also in this piece, you'll even find examples of double flats. So if we go back to bar 5 for a moment, if you have a look at the second chord in the right hand there, it's in the bass clef, you'll notice the second note down is B double flat. So if you need to work that out, just think, well, there's B. So semitone down is B flat. So B double flat will be another semitone down, a note that we would normally call A, but in this case, we're calling B double flat. So, do these things exist? B sharp, E sharp, C flat, F flat? They sure do, for the reasons that I've explained. And why on earth would you want to use double sharps and double flats? Again, hopefully you'll understand that from the reasons I've explained. And having seen it in some real pieces of music, hopefully that kind of brings it to life. And having explored it on the keyboard with a little bit of theory context, hopefully now that makes more sense. Okay, you might have some comments, some questions. Feel free to post them below the video and we'll do our best to respond to those. But I hope that kind of helps to clear up this question, which I know causes a huge amount of confusion.